What's up, everybody? Welcome to another episode of the Churchosity Podcast. My name is Heath Brady, and I am your host.
My name is Andrea Brady, and I'm your co-host.
We're just a couple of Gen Xers trying the best that we possibly can to give you our perspective on church culture. And this podcast is especially dedicated to the Gen X Christians out there.
You know, the ones who just want to keep it simple.
The ones who just want to live quiet, peaceable lives.
Yeah, we represent the generation of Christians who sometimes looks at what others are doing and thinks, whatever. But as it says in 1 Timothy 1:5,
the goal of our instruction is love, from a pure heart, and from a good conscience, and from a sincere faith. So, Andy, my love.
Yes, Heath.
I don't really like it when you say my actual name.
Heath.
It reminds me of when I was a kid and I was in trouble. Heath. But she'd always throw in the middle name or middle initial.
That's right.
Yeah, you don't get to call me that.
No.
It's good to be back in the saddle.
That's right.
From our week's hiatus.
That's right. We need a little time off, didn't we?
Well, it wasn't really much of a hiatus. It was, let's be honest, I was sick. So, yeah, we apologize profusely to our Churchosity listeners that you woke up really probably bright and early, as many of you do, on Monday morning last week. And lo and behold, there was no new episode of Churchosity.
They were probably chomping at the bit for that new episode to drop.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, you know, it's not like we were sipping tropical beverages by the swimming pool.
No. And I almost would have felt guilty for admitting to doing that, especially right in the middle of our current conversation.
Right. It's true. Well, you were sipping cold medicine.
Sipping NyQuil and DayQuil and gallons of water.
Right.
Yeah, I had this it was not the Rona. Let's get that straight.
No.
I did not have the Rona. But there's this really awful, like, nasal throat bug that's going around. And I caught it somehow. I'm not really too sure how I caught it, but I caught it. And it stuck around for about 4.5 days.
Oof.
And I know several people who have also been battling it, and including one of my good friends who his version of it turned into a full-blown sinus infection.
Oh, no.
Yeah, so he was fighting a fever of 102 and the whole 9 yards.
Wow.
So it is definitely great to be on the other side of all of that now.
You made it through and now you're stronger.
We kept saying, I remember I kept saying, honey, do you want to record today?
Like, do you want to record
like,
today?
No, I can't do it. I can't focus. We have too much to talk about.
Yeah.
So in light of that, because of my sickness and illness and agony for 4.5 days, and all of the copious amounts of time I laid on the couch, in front of the television, I was able to watch a lot of movies and TV shows really that I needed to catch up on, essentially. But there's a movie that, and this actually ties into our conversation. There is a movie that I watched that I haven't seen in a really long time. Andy, do you remember back in like the 90s, like the early to mid 90s, the author John Grisham had a bunch of like extraordinary novels?
Extraordinary novels.
Yeah, like
yeah.
The Firm.
Yep.
And
yeah, I can't remember all of his stuff, but yeah, I do remember how popular he was back then.
A Pelican Brief.
There
Brief
you go.
was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
Like he was this author that had these books that were notorious for having like the main character was a lawyer, like fresh out of law school or still in law school.
Right.
That was like the hero of the story in whatever was going on. Mm-hmm. Well, I've read all of those books, including the one called A Time to Kill. And most of these books were all made into movies subsequently throughout the 90s. And the book Time to Kill is way better than the movie. but the movie is still really kind of gripping. The story is about a young lawyer, like pretty fresh out of law school, down in Mississippi, and he gets hired by a black man who has shot and killed 2 white men who assaulted and left for dead his 10-year-old daughter while she was walking home from the grocery store.
Yeah, I remember that.
And it is like it's the deep, it's the deep South. It takes place down in Mississippi, and there are just so many elements that have to do with all things racism and segregation and the whole idea of getting a fair trial and all of it. In the South, they bring in the element of the Ku Klux Klan. It's just like a really intense story. And one of the reasons why I like the book and think it's better than the movie is because in the movie, they basically got all of the popular pretty actors and actresses to star in the movie. But I watched it for the first time in probably 15 years, I'll say.
Yeah.
And in 2022, watching that movie, it hits a little different for me.
Does it?
Yeah. And I encourage all of you, our listeners, to watch this movie. It's especially in light of our conversation that we're having currently on our podcast and just where things are at, especially in America when it comes to the conversations revolving around racism and white privilege. But I want to use that as a launching pad to just jump right into the second part of our conversation about systemic racism and white privilege. So hopefully all of you listened to our previous episode where we introduced the conversation about systemic racism and white privilege. And if you haven't, I encourage you right now to pause this episode and go back and listen. Because there's a lot of things that Andrea, you and I went through. We told stories about our own experiences, our moments of awakening, to the realization that systemic racism and white privilege are in fact a thing.
Right. And for all of our listeners, we're white people.
Yes, we are. If you can't tell, we're white people.
Right. So we're giving our 2 cents, I mean, for whatever it's worth,
It's a conversation that I especially have been wanting to have for quite a long time. And when I had the gumption to consider the possibility of having this conversation on our podcast, it wasn't the right time. And it was because it was around the time that George Floyd was murdered. And that was already just about 2 years ago. And at that time, as I said before, I did not feel qualified at all to even try to have this conversation.
Right.
And today, 2 years later, I think I'm a little more qualified, but I still don't feel like I'm completely qualified.
Yeah, I'm fairly qualified.
And one of the reasons why, and you're going to hear a lot of buzzwords, I think, on this episode, so forgive us in advance if that's the case, and buzzwords and low-hanging fruit terminologies turn you off. It is what it is. But stick with us, because one of the greatest concerns that I have in us doing this and having this conversation, Andy, is that we don't come off sounding at all like we're virtue signaling.
Yeah, we so do not have it all figured out.
We don't. and I think that our honesty around that aspect of this conversation is important to note, because the question that a lot of people who are white, who see things for what they actually are, the question that they're asking is, what can we do? Where can we start? What's the deal? And I think that if we're going to honestly inventory our hearts and our minds and our souls and our convictions and our worldviews, that one of the first things we should look at, honestly, is, do I feel qualified to have an opinion about this at all? And if I don't, that's an honest thing to say. You know, just like I mentioned on the previous episode, my black female friend said to me, you know, you don't need to necessarily do anything right now, but acknowledge the fact that you have privilege because you have white skin, and use that privilege to take away others' privileges.
And point it out.
And point it out when you see it.
Yeah.
Bring it into the light. So on our last episode, we talked about our own experiences, Andy, where we had our eyes opened, and we unpacked that. So again, go back and listen to that if you haven't already, listeners.
Yeah.
Because on this episode, what we want to do is we want to essentially dig a little deeper, talk about some difficult things, and essentially force ourselves to take a hard look in the mirror. And I'm just gonna be curious if at the end of this episode, if our listeners can see what we see. That is the goal of this episode. And then in our next episode, you know, we're gonna take a look at this whole thing and try to answer things from a biblical perspective. Because at the end of the day, as Christians, we believe that Scripture is the final say on everything. God's word is the final authority on all things.
Absolutely.
And so there's no better place to start than finding out what our Heavenly Father has to say about things like, heaven forbid, systemic racism and white privilege.
Right.
So the place I want to start on this episode is to go back and look at Proverbs 31 verse 8 again, which says, "Open your mouth for the mute, for the rights of all the unfortunate." And as I mentioned on our previous episode, that is what we're doing. It's time to open our mouths for those who don't have the ability to open their mouths. Not that we speak for persons of color, but we speak for white people who have no idea where to go from here.
Yeah.
And draw attention to what it is like for people of color who don't have the privilege or the platform to say what needs to be said and to draw attention to the things that need to be drawn attention to.
Right.
And I have to tell you, Andy, it's been kind of a fascinating journey the last couple of years, watching our country here in America and just like how polarizing this conversation became, like instantly after the protests and the rioting and the looting took place.
Could you imagine being a person of color in a majority white church or denomination and having to sift through some of the ignorance? And, you know, I mean, talk about church hurt.
Right.
I just can't even fathom how difficult that must have been, or it still is.
Yeah.
But I think this is a big conversation.
Yeah. And we're barely scratching the surface.
Yeah.
Because I think as Christians, especially once you see it, the question immediately rises to the surface. Well, okay, how could the church be leading the charge in cultural reform when it comes to systemic racism and white privilege?
Right.
So I thought that a good way to kind of unpack this, you know, peel off another layer of the onion, so to speak, was to look at some examples maybe of where you and I, Andy, see systemic racism and white privilege. One of the things that immediately comes to mind for me, I began the previous episode with the story about being able to track my Jewish ancestry all the way back to the early 2nd century. It's like 128 AD. Well, that is a privilege that my particular race enjoys, but pretty much any person who is not of color has the privilege of being able to go to a library or go to a registry or go ask the Mormons who know everything,
right?
And be able to trace your heritage. Mm-hmm. What most people like myself are not aware of is that most persons of color in America, specifically black people in America, have had their ancestral records destroyed.
Yeah.
And that was part of a means to enslaving black people in America and making it virtually impossible for them to advance and become more white. If they were ever going to be, quote, successful in America, you destroy their heritage. Mm-hmm. And that's essentially what's been done. My friend Karen brought that to my attention. I had never considered that before.
Yeah.
That she can only go back about 3 generations. And after that, they have no idea like where their family is from. They don't know what part of the country they're from, etc.
Right.
And so like there's an example of how losing the privilege of ancestral tracking affects the system racially.
Right.
Because specifically a black person in America, more often than not, has lost that privilege because white people from the slave trading era forward erased the opportunity and possibility for most black people of the time and forward to trace their ancestry, heritage, and culture.
Yeah, they were robbed.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, and it's not something that I would normally think about. I mean, until it was pointed out to me.
Because you're white and you don't have to worry about it.
Right. It wasn't, exactly.
It's not a conversation that white people sit around on bar stools having with one another.
Yeah.
Like, oh, gosh, I wish that I could trace my ancestry, but,
Right.
Another example is there are certain conversations that I have never had to have with my children.
Oh.
Such as how to behave if I'm ever pulled over by a police officer.
Oh, that's just so scary.
That's a real thing.
I know.
And I want you to know, listeners of Churchosity, that the reality of a person of color being racially profiled by the law, by the law enforcement agencies in our country, is a real thing. And for years, prior to my awakening, if you will, that point was made to me. And I, like the ignorant person who would say that the Holocaust never happened and I can prove it.
Don't even...
I would say that's not true. I would live in complete denial of that. Even though I've witnessed something similar to that in my past, I still refuse to believe that men and women in this country were being racially profiled by police officers.
Well, in the last episode, I talked about how they were racially profiled at a department store.
Exactly.
So why not, why wouldn't I believe that?
Hey, don't destroy the messenger here. I'm being transparent here. Because that's the transformation that's taking place on the inside in my heart and in my mind, and how my personal worldview has changed, and I see this.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah.
But I didn't always.
Okay.
That's the point. That's what we're trying to do here, right? Mm-hmm. The title of the last episode is I Finally Saw It.
Yeah.
Because guess what? I finally saw it. And now you know what, listeners of Churchosity? I see it everywhere.
Yeah.
What about our history books in school, Andy?
Yeah. Well, I've heard a lot of talk about how they're whitewashed.
Yeah. And what do you mean by that? What do you mean when you say whitewashed history books?
Well, as an example, if you have to write a separate book that talks about Black history, that's kind of sad because we didn't really learn much in American high schools and middle schools about Black history.
Yeah. Well, we're Gen Xers, so
right. That's true. We
grew up in the 70s.
Mm-hmm. We still thought Christopher Columbus discovered America.
And was an upstanding individual who did great things for our country.
Right.
And blessed the indigenous folk who were already here with gifts.
Right, exactly.
But we grew up in the 70s, and the way that you and I, or at least people from our generation, were introduced to, quote, Black culture in America was by watching Roots.
Well, I never got to watch Roots.
Well, I remember when it was on TV in the 70s.
Yeah,
I remember that.
Mm-hmm.
I also remember watching it again in the 6th grade and again in the 7th grade.
Wow.
And then again in the 11th grade.
Okay. Yeah, we watched a lot of videos in class.
Yeah.
In the 80s.
But I'll be the first one to admit, Andy, when it comes to the educational system that I experienced in the public high schools in the United States of America, when it comes to Black culture and the history of Black people in America, that was the extent of my education. Was Roots and having a conversation about slavery and the civil rights movement and Martin Luther.
We learn about Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks.
Yeah, the typical canned answers and canned subject matter, and it was just kind of glossed over.
Yeah, but we never learned about Black Wall Street.
I'm glad that you brought that up because I have a confession to make.
What?
It was not until the rioting and looting of the spring and early summer of 2020 that I had ever heard of Black Wall Street.
Wow.
I had never heard of this, ever. And I'm pretty sure that unless some of our listeners had their heads buried in the sand all through that part of 2020 and never heard Black Wall Street ever mentioned.
Right.
And you may have never even heard it mentioned before that ever. Let me give you just a very brief synopsis of what we're talking about when we refer to what's commonly known as Black Wall Street. This was an incident. There was an incident that took place in Tulsa, Oklahoma on May 31st and June 1st of 1921. So it's 100 years ago. Okay?
Oh, wow. Yeah.
It was actually officially called the Tulsa Race Massacre, and it was when mobs of white residents, who some of which were given weapons and deputized by city officials, they attacked Black residents and destroyed homes and businesses in the Greenwood district of Tulsa, Oklahoma. It was alternatively known as the Tulsa Race Riot. We know it today as Black Wall Street Massacre. It's considered the single worst incident of racial violence in American history. The attackers, who were white people, they burned and destroyed more than 35 square blocks of the neighborhood.
Oh my gosh.
And at this time, this was one of the wealthiest Black communities in the United States.
Yeah, very successful.
That's why it was known as Black Wall Street. More than 800 people were admitted to hospitals. As many as 6,000 Black residents of Tulsa were interned in large facilities, many of them for several days. It is estimated that there was anywhere between 75 and 300 that died in this massacre.
Oh my.
Because the records are all conflicting. But the bottom line is that you had this incident take place where a bunch of white men got together with weapons and torched and burned and destroyed more than 35 square blocks of a neighborhood in Tulsa, Oklahoma.
Oh my goodness. And there are a lot of people left homeless then.
A lot of people left homeless. There's
Black people were left homeless.
About 10,000 Black people were left homeless is what I have come to understand.
Oh my goodness.
The property damage was more than $1.5 million, which that's $1921.
Millions then
Yeah.
in today's, yeah.
Yeah. So that's a thing. That's a matter of history for Black folks in America. that I never learned about in school. Now, we don't have all the time necessary to unpack all of the edited history books that you and I were victims of.
Yeah.
But I guarantee you that nowhere in any of my history books when I was in school did it contain this story. But you want to know something that's really interesting, something that I read?
What?
The schools in Oklahoma have been required to teach students about this massacre since the year 2002.
Oh.
But in the year 2020,
yeah,
the massacre officially became a part of the Oklahoma school curriculum.
Oh, wow.
So there's light at the end of the tunnel for you.
Yeah, that's good.
About, pulling back the curtain on things that have really taken place in the black communities in the history of our nation.
Yeah. I think a part of our ignorance as white people is the fact that we haven't been taught the full truth of things that have happened in our past or in, the country's past.
Right.
And people that are ignorant and they don't know the history and they don't understand what the problem is, whitewashing history books in the American education system has caused a lot of problems in that area. I
would say that it's contributed to the systemic racism because they've essentially, what's essentially happened is that history was rewritten.
Yeah.
For the purpose of elevating the white experience.
Right. And leaving things out of important things like that out of our history books.
Intentionally.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. It's kind of like a lie.
Yeah.
If you can outright bold-faced lie to somebody, but, omitting the truth is still kind of a lie too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Omitting the truth?
Yeah.
Yeah. I would 100% agree with that. Yeah. Can you think back to the times of the protests and the rioting that spring and early summer?
Yeah.
And can you reflect upon how watching those things go down made you feel? Like seeing those images on television and on the internet and stuff?
Yeah, I remember.
I mean, we hail from the Seattle area.
Right.
Which, Seattle during the protests and rioting had the famous CHOP/Chaz thing.
Right.
I don't want to talk about that. But, what was it like for you, Andy, honestly, watching our fair city suffer through the protests and the rioting and the looting and all that stuff? Watching businesses board up their windows and go through all of that experience. Do you remember how it made you feel?
I was mixed. I had mixed feelings. I had feelings like I was basking in some of my privilege in that I lived in a very nice area that was mainly white, and we didn't see a lot of things happening in our neighborhood and in our backyard. And we were far enough away from all of the rioting and things like that where I felt comfortable and safe. And yet I knew a part of me felt a little bit like, I don't know how to help this other than watch what happens next. And I don't know what I should be doing as a Christian or how I should be feeling about all of this, other than I came to the conclusion that I needed to make sure I was listening. I mean, I was taking it in and listening to what people of color were saying and trying to, like you said, take a hard look in the mirror. And I'm confessing to you that I was, basking in my privilege in my nice little white neighborhood. And far enough removed from the action that if I wanted to turn off the TV and go back to doing what I was doing, it wouldn't affect me.
Right.
I could stick my head in the sand if I wanted to. But I decided that, that as a white person who's far enough removed from that, I wanted to take a hard look in the mirror, and I wanted to open my eyes and open my ears, and I wanted to pay attention. And if nothing else, I wanted to listen, and I wanted to learn and be open to, change in my own heart.
Personal reform.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so beautiful. And I'll tell you why. Full disclosure, for me, when the rioting started, I was a little upset.
Oh.
In my heart, I was a little upset because I'm not a proponent of violence at all. And it was through the tool of the internet and seeing the copious amounts of protests and rioting that I came across the video on YouTube where a black woman is rather controlled, I would say, full of rage, though, explaining why the rioting is necessary. And in that video was where I heard the term Black Wall Street for the first time. So, like you said, you wanted to, you knew in your heart you needed to listen. You knew that you felt compelled, I would say, to sit down and listen and hear and see and watch, and then take all of that information in and go look in the mirror.
Yeah. And
say, where's my heart in this? And it was almost instantaneous that my feelings and my heart about the rioting and being disgruntled over it completely went away.
Wow.
Not that I condone violence, but here's the thing. And this might get a little uncomfortable for some of you, and that's okay. It needs to be uncomfortable. Some of the most uncomfortable things for us to take a look at within ourselves are the things that will do the greatest work in our hearts. During those periods of protesting, I was part of a circle of evangelical Christians that had less than pleasant responses to the protests and rioting.
Yeah.
One night in Seattle, there was a protest that was taking place late at night, and if memory serves, all of the necessary requirements to safely close down the freeway so that the protest could take place, it was all done. Like it was good.
All the permits and all that.
Everything was
filed.
good to go,
yeah.
right? This was to be a, quote, peaceful protest. And it was, for all intents and purposes, a peaceful protest. Well, there was a breakdown somewhere in the system, and a man in a pickup truck drove in the wrong direction intentionally down the freeway, on the side of the freeway where this peaceful protest was taking place. And he plowed through the crowd of protesters with his truck. Right. Several people were horribly injured. 2 people were killed. One of those people who lost their life that night was a person by the name of Summer Taylor. And they lost their life protesting systemic racism and white privilege. Now, what's grosser than what happened to Summer, for me, I know Summer's family personally.
Yeah.
I have been friends with Summer's mother since the 6th grade. And this wrecked me because I had met Summer. Like, I knew Summer and their family. But what's even grosser than that is that one of the evangelical Christians in my circle wore a t-shirt. And on that t-shirt was a picture of someone driving a truck, running somebody over, and it said, "All lives splatter."
Yeah.
I was undone over that.
Right.
Just put on the shelf the conversation we're having about systemic racism and white privilege, what sane human being that would call themselves a Christian would think even in the slightest bit comical about that? Mm-hmm. What is funny about that? Mm-hmm. What is moral about that? What is ethical about that? Mm-hmm. And then it goes one step further. This man took a picture of it and posted it on his social media.
Right.
Now bring it back. If I'm a person of color and I see that, what do you think's going through my head? You see what I'm saying?
Yeah. Well, and this person was a person that went to church. How comfortable do you think people of color would be in that church if one of the I wouldn't say highly respected, highly
revered people in the congregation?
Yeah.
Highly elevated people in the congregation?
Something like that on their social media. You know?
I just, for the life of me, I still to this day, I cannot figure out where in that man's brain, especially as a Christian, how was he able to justify to himself that was okay?
Yeah. Well, besides, singling out that one person, anybody's kind of response to something like that, how is that displaying Christ's love?
Right.
That's being divisive. How it's not fostering fellowship with one another.
And I remember saying to you, Andy, in the moment, how does that man wearing that shirt in this moment in history make Christ and the gospel and albeit his church attractional to anybody, especially persons of color?
Right. How does that help people of color feel heard, seen, valued, or cared for at all?
And then, of course, that spills over into the conversation revolving around Black Lives Matter. And, that's what it was poking fun at. All lives splatter, right. Black Lives Matter, then the Blue Lives Matter and All Lives Matter, all of that thing. Mm-hmm. And if you're a white person in that moment in history in 2020,
right,
the ignorant misconceptions of us white people trying to have those conversations with other white people, especially evangelicals, right, especially Protestant Christians, we all got labeled as woke. And I've been asked before. You've even asked me in jest.
What?
You sound like you're woke.
I joke because somehow it became a bad word in evangelical Christianity. The whole word evangelical is a bad word now.
Yeah. Well, that's a different podcast. And so my response to being labeled as woke still is the same thing, that I'm not woke. I'm just awake enough because I see it.
Right.
I see it everywhere. And I'm on a mission to make it plain, clear, and obvious to help other people see it.
Right.
And so, in addition to the various ignorant responses and misconceptions of what to do about this stuff, was white people who were really, really busy trying to virtue signal. You had everybody blacking out their profile pictures on their social media, and they really didn't even understand what they were doing.
Or posting their Black Lives Matter poster in their front yard.
Yeah, all that stuff. And, trying to get their token friend of color on the phone to make sure that everything's all good and that that your relationship with them is on fire still. It was really ridiculous. That's where this Proverbs 31 verse 8 and 9 conversation comes from. I was part of a men's Bible study that ironically smack dab in the middle of all of these protests and rioting and looting. That's what these men were studying.
Mm-hmm. Ironically.
Okay. And these men, and we were all on Zoom calls because remember, it's COVID Central Time and we're all in lockdown. So we're having a Zoom meeting of a Bible study. And these men are talking about how, only peaceful protests are okay. And my ancestors didn't own slaves. And I wasn't raised a racist. And I don't know what these people are talking about. And I want you to hear something, listeners. All of that is true. All of that can be true.
Mm-hmm.
And yet you can still 100% miss the boat on this. You can 100% miss the point being made here.
Mm-hmm.
And I recently heard a fantastic analogy that was given on another podcast that you and I like to listen to.
Oh, yeah?
A gentleman by the name of Philip Holmes gave this fabulous analogy.
What's the name of his podcast?
Make It Plain. It's a fabulous podcast. Look it up, listen to it. It's Philip Holmes and a co-host that talk about quotes of Malcolm X from a Christian perspective. We normally don't give gratuitous plugs for other people's podcasts. This one is definitely worth listening to, especially if you're becoming awake enough and have questions.
Okay.
So Philip Holmes gives this analogy on one of his episodes, and he says, imagine if somebody stole your car a long time ago. Like, maybe I'll paraphrase it to make it sound a little bit more understandable for us. Imagine when you were 16 and your parents bought you a car and you had it for like a little while and somebody stole it.
Mm-hmm.
And then that person who stole that car from you fixed whatever damage they had done to it when they stole it, and then gave that car or sold that car to somebody else. And then several years goes by. And
like
now,
a lot of years?
Like, let's say you're middle-aged now. You're 65. And, you know, knocking on the door of collecting Social Security, let's say.
All right.
And you're at the mall. And you're walking out to the parking lot to go get into your car, and all of a sudden you see your car that was stolen from you when you were 16 years old.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody else is driving it now. So you drop everything, go run over to that car, knock on the car door window, and the guy rolls down his window, and you say, hey, this is my car. This was my car given to me when I was 16 years old, and somebody stole it from me. And the guy says, well, I don't know anything about that. I didn't steal your car.
Mm.
And so in that moment, that person who's driving the previously stolen car has a choice to make. Either give you back your car that is rightfully due to you, or say, no, I'm keeping my car, bro. I'm sorry that you got your car stolen, but I didn't steal your car. My parents didn't steal your car.
Right. And you've had plenty of time since it was stolen to get another car.
And stealing cars isn't really a thing and we do anymore.
Right.
So do you get the analogy, Andy?
Yeah, I get it.
That white people who talk about how their ancestors didn't own slaves or that they were not raised to see color, like all of those things might be true. But it doesn't take away the fact that persons of color, and in context, specifically black people in America, had their livelihood taken from them. And by merely acknowledging that it was something that happened in the past and stopping at that point, we're still robbing persons of color the fairness and equality and privilege that us white people get to enjoy. One of the ways that we have, in the church especially, have kind of overcorrected on this icy road of systemic racism is by trying to seek after engaging or creating a, quote, multicultural church or multi-ethnic church. Mm-hmm. And so that begs the question, what on earth then should or could a multi-ethnic church look like? And Andy, you probably have something to say about that.
Well, I don't know if I'm not saying that every church should be multicultural. I know that sounds weird, but I think that really people of color need to be driving the bus on where they want to go to church and who they want to worship with. I think if people of color come through the front doors of our church, we need to be welcoming. We need to value them. We need to see them. We need to hear them, and we need to care for them. And we need to be willing to do all of those things.
So let me ask you a quick question, Andy.
What?
Is a multi-ethnic church a place of worship where a white evangelical culture exists and tries to make considerations for persons of color so that persons of color might feel comfortable worshiping in that environment?
Well, I think that it should be a place where everybody can give and take. I don't think that it should be a place where a black person comes in and they have to feel like they need to assimilate.
Assimilate to
white people culture and white people standards and what white people do for worship.
Exactly. And that is the biggest, I think, one of the biggest misperceptions of what a multi-ethnic or multicultural church actually is. Mm-hmm. Have you heard by chance, Andy, of what's called the 80% rule?
Yeah.
What is the 80% rule?
Something to be actually considered a multicultural church is where you have 80%, less than 80% of one race. Of one
particular race.
Yeah.
So if at my church I was to do a census and find out that 79% of my church was white.
Right.
By that standard, I attend a multi-ethnic church.
Yeah.
That's what that 80% rule.
Multicultural church,
or
right.
Multicultural church, right. That's what that 80% rule. So if
that's what they say.
That's whoever they are, right?
Right.
They are probably white also.
Yeah, probably.
There's another podcast that you and I enjoy listening to. Mm-hmm. And here's another gratuitous plug for this podcast as well. It's called Truth Over Tribe. Mm-hmm. Fantastic podcast. Probably my favorite podcast besides Churchosity.
Yeah.
It's definitely second compared to Churchosity.
Right.
But all kidding aside, fabulous podcast. I highly encourage our listeners, as an addition to listening to Churchosity, look up Truth Over Tribe. Mm-hmm. But they had a particular guest on one of their episodes recently that talked about this very thing.
Right.
That this pastor's church is a multicultural or multi-ethnic church. He is the lead pastor, and he's a black man, and his associate pastor is a white man.
Right.
And they pastor together. And what I found so intriguing, I mean, there's a lot of really cool things that this man talked about while he was being interviewed on that episode.
Sean Boone.
Mm-hmm. And he pastors a church by the name of Wokebridge Church.
Wokebridge Community Church.
Wokebridge Community Church, that's right. But he shared some really, really valuable keynotes, I believe, about how the church could possibly be spearheading the effort of cultural reform when it comes to things like systemic racism and white privilege. Right. He talked a lot about how he and his associate pastor hold one another accountable to ensure that both conversations are happening at the same time in the black community and the white community and all communities that represent that church body. Mm-hmm. So that one is not represented more than the other one.
Right.
And it's not a matter of making persons of color comfortable. Mm-hmm. It's about literally forcing, and I use that word loosely, it's literally forcing all peoples, tribes, tongues, and nations who worship under the same roof to ask the same tough questions and have the same hard, high-level expectations of themselves when dealing with or relating to persons of other cultural backgrounds in their church community. Mm-hmm. It's literally being the hands and feet of Jesus Christ to one another.
Right. And they're also, I mean, Christ is at the center of all that they are doing. Mm-hmm. You know, they're walking through life together. I mean, their mission statement says, As a multi-ethnic community in North County, we are learning to walk through life together, equip each other for service, and make Jesus known in all that we do.
That is so beautiful.
Yeah.
Man, I wish that every Protestant evangelical church in the United States of America had that for their mission statement. I love that. It's so
I love that
beautiful.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So
I think that's where our heart needs to be. Whether God calls our church to be a multicultural church or not, I think that's where all of our hearts should be.
And that's where you can get into the dangerous waters of virtue signaling by striving to convert your church into a multicultural church for the sake of cultural reform.
Right.
Because, not every church is in the right place at the right time to have that be their effort. Mm-hmm. But if you're a church that's in a neighborhood, that's in a city that is surrounded by diverse cultures, by all means, that should be the goal, I would think. So, where do we start to make a change? Where's a starting point? Because I get asked that a lot, Andy.
Right.
I remember that moment when I was sitting with my friend Karen, and I felt like I had been born again, and I just wanted to grab anybody within earshot and tell them what I knew and what I see. Mm-hmm. And yet, the lingering question that never has gone away is. It sounds something like this. I see it. I know that something needs to be done. I just don't know what that is. Mm-hmm. What do I do? Where do I start? Right?
Right.
As the Church of Jesus Christ, what do we do, Andy? Where do we start?
Start with the man in the mirror.
Ooh, Michael Jackson had it right.
I would sing it, but
I'm starting with the man in the mirror.
Yeah.
Sorry. It's true, though.
Yeah.
You got to look at yourself.
Right.
And see what your heart looks like. See where your heart's at. What's your worldview? Mm-hmm. How do you see, react to, respond to, behave around people outside of your culture, your ethnic background?
Right.
In the church, that's a perfect place to start. On a personal level, I would think.
Right.
But I think, in addition to that, and maybe even tantamount to that, is taking a real good look at the gospel. Because what does the gospel actually do, Andy? Who is the gospel for?
It's for everyone.
Are there regulations on which ethnic background gets to hear and respond to the gospel?
No.
Of course not.
With God, there's no partiality.
Absolutely none, right?
Right.
Now, understand, ladies and gentlemen, I don't want you to mishear what we're saying. Cultural reform, especially in light of this context of systemic racism and white privilege, cultural reform does not supersede and surely does not replace the gospel.
No.
Because the gospel is the means by which we are saved. We know this, right? Mm-hmm. But what does the gospel actually do for us as the body of Christ? What is the gospel? Well, listen to some interesting verses from our favorite person on the Churchosity podcast, the Apostle Paul.
He's our guest a lot.
Yeah. We have a chair here in the office reserved for the Apostle Paul every single week. But in Colossians chapter 3, Paul starts off by kind of giving a list of things that Christians, that people of Christ, that the church should be focusing on and not focusing on and to do away with in their behavior. And then he adds on to that. In verse 8, starting in verse 8 of Colossians chapter 3, Paul says, "But now also put these aside, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you laid aside the old self with its evil practices, and have put on the new self, who is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him." Now, let me stop there. That is literally how I felt the moment that my eyes were opened about systemic racism and white privilege. That I felt like I was part of that group of people that was lying to one another as if these things don't exist. And because through my experience at the Little Mermaid show, that felt like I was born again, that I've put on this new self and renewed to a true knowledge. Like I saw it, right?
Yeah.
In that context, listen to what Paul says going forward. A renewal in which there is no distinction between Greek or Jew, circumcised or uncircumcised, barbarian or Scythian, slave or free man, but Christ is all and in all.
Right.
Boom. There's the gospel. The gospel call goes out to everyone. There is no distinction, as you said, Andy. There is no distinction. Doesn't matter what your ethnic background is. Doesn't matter what your religious background is. Doesn't matter what your social or cultural background is. Doesn't matter what your educational background is. It doesn't matter what your economic status is. Christ is available for all and ruler of all. And that, I think, is where we start, is by going back to the basics and asking hard questions about what the gospel actually is, what the gospel actually does, and who the gospel is actually for.
Right.
Because when we in the church, especially white folks in the church, elevate ourselves, even in an ignorant way, to some spiritual hierarchy and withhold the truths of the authentic gospel from people who are of a different ethnic background, skin color, whatever, we are creating a distinction that Paul says never existed in the first place. And that's on the church for doing that.
Yeah.
And so Paul goes on. So as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion. Well, how can you stare systemic racism and white privilege in the face and not have a heart of compassion?
Right.
Kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another. That reminds me of all of those white people who were standing in the streets protesting right alongside persons of color.
Coming alongside.
Bearing with one another. And forgiving each other. Now, on our next episode, we're going to unpack that phrase and go real deep and cut hard. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, that's what Paul's getting at here. Bear with one another, forgive each other, whoever might have a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so should you. At the end of the day, the gospel is the springboard towards reconciliation, forgiveness, and camaraderie amongst one another.
Amen.
It's all deep. It's pretty deep. It's pretty
very
heavy.
Deep.
So,
do you see it?
Do you see it, listeners of Churchosity? Because if you still don't see it, go back and listen to everything we just talked about again. Hit the rewind. Go back to the beginning. It's easy. Just swipe. And listen to what we've said again. And then go take a hard look in the mirror. And our goal here isn't to say we're right, we've got it all figured out.
No.
Because guess what? We don't have it all figured out. That's why we're talking about this. But what I do believe we are correct about is that systemic racism and white privilege exist, and the church should, could, would be the front runner for cultural reform if it just took a hard look in the mirror at itself and saw the condition of its heart and its outreach and its mission. And that brings us to this week's proof that we're living in the last days. All right, Andy.
You got something for me this
Oh,
week?
man. I have been chomping at the bit, and I really wish that I wasn't sick all last week because I wanted to bring this up back then, so a lot of this is probably going to be old news.
Oh?
But I don't care.
Okay. What?
This whole Johnny Depp Amber Heard defamation trial thing, I'm telling you, not since the
dear.
OJ trial have I been so, enthralled in what is going on in a court case with celebrities.
You mean the defecation trial?
The defecation trial? That's terrible. Shame on you.
Sorry. I just had to.
Now, at the risk of sounding insulting to an entire gender, we may actually be on the verge of witnessing a woman being found guilty of not only defaming a man's character, but actually abusing him.
Yeah. Wow. That could be interesting to see.
You talk about cultural reform.
Yeah.
I mean, do you remember, way back in the day? It must have been back in, the 90s or something.
Frasier.
Kelsey Grammer.
Yes.
Went on the Oprah Winfrey Show and exposed to the entire world that his wife had been physically assaulting him throughout their entire marriage.
Wow. I know, it was kind of mind-blowing.
And it was mind-blowing because that was the time period when the emasculation of men in our culture was really on full throttle. So, imagine a man who is a celebrity that plays a having it all together man on a popular television sitcom is bearing his soul to the entire world that the woman, his main squeeze, his wife in his life, has been beating the crap out of him their entire marriage.
Wow.
A lot of people probably have never heard of that story. So here we are, fast forward 2022.
Yeah. And
we're literally capable through the tools of technology to enter into the intimate, gory details of a celebrity marriage and what went on behind closed doors.
People are really into this trial.
Well, to be fair, I'm only watching the recaps. I'm not watching the trial.
Right, exactly.
All that to say, we might actually be on the verge of a very, very popular woman in Hollywood being found guilty of defaming a man's character and exposed as a spousal abuser. I just think that that's fascinating.
That is.
It gives me hope.
Hope?
It gives me hope that somehow the scales of justice in the court of popular opinion might actually be shifting towards a balance.
Okay.
I don't know. Because for me, as a man,
yeah,
I think that if it's possible in the court of popular opinion and in a court of law, a wife can be found guilty of abusing her husband physically. That is definitely proof that we are, in fact, living in the last days.
And that's all we have to say about that.
Thank you for tuning in once again to another episode of the Churchosity Podcast, the show where we try to give you the Gen X take on church culture. And thank you once again to my amazing, fabulous, and wonderful co-host.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you. Be sure to follow us on all the socials. That's Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Our handle is @ChurchosityPod. Drop us a message and give us your feedback because we'd really love to hear from you.
And if you happen to be listening to this episode on either Apple Podcasts or Spotify, please be sure to just take a few extra seconds and give us a rating. And if you feel like it, give us a review as well. The ratings and reviews not only help popularize the Churchosity Podcast, but also make us a lot easier for other people to find us. And you can also spread the word about Churchosity Podcast by just simply telling your friends what we're doing here.
Yeah, let them be a part of the conversation too.
But please always remember that the goal of our instruction is love.
From a pure heart.
And from a good conscience.
And a sincere faith.
So we thank all of you once again for listening, and we hope to catch every single one of you on the next episode of the Churchosity Podcast. Peace.